Revenge tastes sweetest when served cold, but nobody warned Victoria Sterling that it could also completely shatter a frozen heart. Marrying her sworn enemy's bloodline was a calculated strike, a ruthless corporate maneuver. Everything went exactly according to her master plan, until a little girl with terrified eyes changed absolutely everything. Billionaires do not feel love. They recognize leverage. Victoria Sterling, the 32-year-old CEO of Sterling Vanguard, lived by this singular, unforgiving philosophy. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Manhattan corner office, the city looked like a massive chessboard, and Victoria was always 3 moves ahead. She possessed an icy, untouchable beauty, armored in bespoke Tom Ford suits, and an expression that routinely brought seasoned executives to their knees. However, beneath the silk and the billions, a decade-old inferno raged. 10 years ago, her father, Charles Sterling, was systematically destroyed by a vicious corporate raider named Richard Hayes. Richard had stripped Sterling Industries down to the studs, stolen their patents, and driven Charles to a despair so profound he took his own life. Since that day, Victoria had built her own empire from the ashes with one goal: the absolute, total annihilation of Richard Hayes. The opportunity finally materialized in the form of an archaic ironclad clause within the Hayes family trust. Richard, currently sitting on 49% of Hayes Global, needed the remaining 51% to take the company fully private and cement his monopoly. But the trust, written by a traditionalist grandfather, stipulated that the shares would only unlock if Richard's estranged younger brother, Arthur, was legally married and demonstrating family stability for a minimum of 6 months. If Arthur failed to meet these conditions by his 35th birthday, the shares would be dispersed to public charities. Richard had been hunting for his brother for years to force him into a sham marriage. Victoria found him first. Arthur Hayes was nothing like the polished, venomous serpent his brother was. When Victoria's private investigator, David Kensington, finally tracked him down, Arthur was living in a dilapidated 2-bedroom walk-up in Astoria, Queens. He worked agonizingly long hours as a custom furniture restorer, his hands calloused and stained with varnish. More importantly, Arthur was a single father to a silent, fragile 6-year-old girl named Chloe. Victoria orchestrated their accidental meeting with military precision. She bought the building Arthur lived in and immediately issued eviction notices, plunging him into a desperate financial corner. Then, she arrived as a supposed anonymous benefactor, stepping into the sawdust-covered workshop where Arthur was furiously trying to salvage an antique cabinet. When Arthur looked up, Victoria was momentarily caught off guard. He possessed a rugged, exhausted handsomeness, with deep-set, weary eyes that carried the weight of the world. There was no arrogance in his posture, only the defensive tension of a man pushed to the brink. "Mr. Hayes," Victoria said, her voice smooth and devoid of warmth. "I am Victoria Sterling, and I am here to solve all of your problems." Arthur wiped his hands on a rag, stepping defensively between Victoria and the small door leading to the back office where his daughter was drawing. "I don't know any Sterlings, and I don't accept charity. You have 3 minutes before I ask you to leave." Victoria did not flinch. She opened her designer briefcase, retrieved a thick, cream-colored dossier, and dropped it onto the workbench. "This is a marriage contract. You are going to sign it. In exchange, I will deposit $10 million into an offshore trust for you, and I will immediately secure the absolute best pediatric cardiology team at Mount Sinai for your daughter, Chloe." Arthur went rigid. The mention of his daughter's severe heart condition, a secret he guarded fiercely, made his jaw clench. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, protective whisper. How do you know about Chloe? I know that your brother, Richard, is currently trying to locate you to force you into a marriage of his choosing. Victoria lied effortlessly, spinning a web of half-truths. I despise your brother. By marrying me, you secure your daughter's future, and you deny Richard the compliance he expects. In 18 months, we divorce quietly. You take the money. I take the satisfaction of ruining Richard's timeline. Arthur stared at the contract, his eyes darting to the back room. The hum of the cheap space heater was the only sound in the room. He was drowning in medical debt. The hospital had already threatened to discharge Chloe from the experimental treatment program. Arthur looked back at Victoria, his expression a mix of disgust and agonizing defeat. "No press," Arthur finally said, his voice cracking slightly. "No cameras, and you do not ever involve Chloe in whatever twisted corporate war you are fighting." "Agreed," Victoria said, sliding a silver fountain pen across the wood. They were married 3 days later, in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room at the downtown courthouse. Victoria wore a sharp black blazer. Arthur wore a clean but faded navy suit. There were no rings, no vows of affection, and no audience aside from Victoria's unsmiling lawyers. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, they didn't even share a glance. It was the most expensive, calculated business acquisition Victoria had ever made. She had secured the weapon she needed to destroy her enemy. She just hadn't accounted for the fact that a weapon has a soul. The transition into Victoria's sprawling, minimalist penthouse on the Upper East Side was silent and jarring. The residence was a fortress of glass, black marble, and modern art, a space designed for high-stakes cocktail parties, not for the messy reality of a child. On their first evening, Victoria stood in the foyer, her arms crossed, laying out the ground rules. Arthur stood before her, holding a small duffel bag, while Chloe hid entirely behind his legs, her tiny fingers tightly gripping the fabric of his jeans. "The East Wing is entirely yours," Victoria instructed, her tone brisk. "My study, the formal dining room, and the master suite are strictly off-limits. You have an unlimited household account for groceries and necessities. I work late, often until midnight. I expect quiet. We will make exactly 3 public appearances together this year to satisfy the Trust's legal observers. Other than that, we live separate lives." "Understood," Arthur replied quietly. He didn't ask for a tour. He simply scooped up his daughter, who buried her face in his neck, and walked down the long, shadowed hallway toward their assigned rooms. For the first 3 weeks, Victoria barely saw them. It was as if she lived with a ghost and a shadow. Arthur was meticulous about staying out of her way. He still left early every morning to work at his restoration shop, refusing to touch a single dime of the $10 million for his own personal use. He only used Victoria's medical connections for Chloe's appointments, maintaining a fierce, proud independence that secretly baffled Victoria. Despite her attempts to ignore her new husband, the sterile perfection of Victoria's life began to show microscopic cracks. She would come into the kitchen at 2 a.m. to find a plate of warm, homemade food carefully wrapped on the granite island, simply labeled with a sticky note. "You missed dinner." She threw the first 2 away, out of sheer stubbornness. By the 3rd week, exhausted and hungry after a brutal negotiation call, she ate the roasted chicken. It tasted painfully like a home she hadn't had since her father died. Then there was Chloe. Victoria had quickly learned from her investigator that the 6-year-old had not spoken a single word in over 2 years. The medical files cited severe psychological trauma preceding her heart condition, though the details were heavily redacted. Victoria, hardened by the business world, had assumed Arthur was simply another careless man who had brought a child into a broken environment. Her perspective shattered entirely on a stormy Tuesday night in November. A massive thunderstorm rolled over Manhattan, rattling the reinforced glass of the penthouse. Victoria was in her study, aggressively highlighting discrepancies in Richard Hayes's financial ledgers, preparing for the final strike. Suddenly, a deafening crack of thunder shook the floorboards. A moment later, the heavy oak door of her study creaked open. Victoria frowned, ready to reprimand Arthur, but the doorway was empty. She lowered her reading glasses and peered over her mahogany desk. Standing there, shivering violently in an oversized pink pajama top, was Chloe. The little girl's face was pale, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, her hands clamped over her ears. "Chloe," Victoria said, her sharp tone inadvertently softening. "You aren't supposed to be in here." The child didn't retreat. Instead, driven by a primal terror of the storm, she ran forward and squeezed herself into the small space beneath Victoria's heavy desk, curling into a tight, trembling ball against Victoria's feet. Victoria froze. She was a woman who commanded thousands of employees, a woman who routinely destroyed older, powerful men in boardrooms. But looking down at the small, terrified child, clutching her ankles, she was completely paralyzed. Slowly, awkwardly, Victoria reached down and rested a tentative, manicured hand on the little girl's head. Chloe leaned into the touch instantly. "Chloe!" Arthur burst into the study a second later, his chest heaving, panic written all over his face. He was wearing only sweatpants, his chest bare. When he saw his daughter beneath Victoria's desk, he let out a jagged breath of relief and dropped to his knees. "I'm so sorry," Arthur said rapidly, reaching out to gently coax the girl from her hiding spot. "She woke up from the thunder. I was in the kitchen getting her medication. I'm sorry she disturbed you, Victoria." As Arthur reached under the desk, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated his back and shoulders. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Crisscrossing Arthur's muscular back were thick, jagged scars. They were old, but brutally distinct. Burn marks and deep lacerations that spoke of repeated, systematic abuse. This wasn't the kind of scarring from a workshop accident. This was the result of deliberate violence. "Arthur," Victoria murmured, the hostility completely draining from her voice. "What happened to your back?" Arthur flinched as if he had been struck. He quickly pulled a t-shirt from his shoulder that he had been using as a rag, throwing it over his torso. His eyes hardened, building an impenetrable wall. "It's nothing. Come on, Ladybug, let's go back to bed." He lifted Chloe into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that violently contrasted with the scars on his skin. He didn't look back as he carried her out of the room, leaving Victoria alone in the deafening silence of the study. That night, Victoria did not return to her ledgers. Instead, she opened a secure, encrypted browser and bypassed her usual corporate investigator. She hired a specialized fixer, someone who dealt in buried police reports and sealed family court records. She typed in a new directive. She no longer wanted to know about Richard Hayes's corporate holdings. She wanted to know exactly what Richard Hayes had done to his younger brother. When the file arrived in her inbox 48 hours later, Victoria Sterling, the Ice Queen of Manhattan, sat in her office and wept. The truth was far more horrific than she could have ever imagined. Arthur wasn't a deadbeat who had run away from his family's wealth. He was a survivor who had fought his way out of hell. And the biggest, most earth-shattering secret wasn't Arthur's scars. It was the birth certificate attached to the final page of the dossier. Arthur wasn't Chloe's biological father. Richard was. Dawn broke over the Manhattan skyline, casting a cold, grey light through the penthouse windows. But Victoria Sterling had not slept a single minute. Her mahogany desk was covered in the devastating reality of Arthur Hayes's life. According to the heavily encrypted files pulled by her fixer, Chloe was the product of a brief, concealed affair between Richard Hayes and a young, struggling gallery assistant named Sarah Jenkins. When Sarah tragically passed away from complications during childbirth, Richard was left with a daughter he never wanted. Worse, in Richard's eyes, Chloe was born with a congenital heart defect, a flaw that threatened his carefully curated public image of genetic and corporate perfection. The records showed Richard had immediately initiated proceedings to quietly surrender Chloe to an underfunded, state-run institution, sealing the records to erase her existence. Arthur, who had spent his entire life enduring Richard's psychological and physical torture behind closed doors, had finally snapped. He could not save himself from his older brother, but he could save the infant. The files indicated Arthur had forged custody documents, taken Chloe in the dead of night, and vanished into the labyrinth of New York City, sacrificing his inheritance and his safety to protect a child that wasn't even his. He had spent the last 6 years looking over his shoulder, terrified of the day Richard would find them and file kidnapping charges to punish him. Victoria closed the file. Her hands, usually perfectly steady during billion-dollar mergers, were shaking. The vengeance she had harbored for her father's death suddenly felt entirely different. It was no longer just about destroying a corporate rival. It was about annihilating a monster. She walked out of her study and headed straight for the kitchen. Arthur was already awake, standing by the espresso machine. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes bruised and heavy. Victoria walked up to the marble island and placed the dossier face down on the counter. "You are not her biological father," Victoria stated. Her voice wasn't harsh. It was laced with a quiet, dangerous awe. Arthur's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering violently against the hardwood floor. The hot liquid splashed over his boots, but he didn't even flinch. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He took a slow, defensive step backward, his eyes darting toward the hallway where Chloe was sleeping. "How did you—" Arthur choked on the words, his chest heaving with sudden, blinding panic. "Victoria, please. You promised no press. You promised not to involve her. If Richard finds out I have her, he won't just take her away. He will destroy her just to break me. Please. I'll sign whatever you want. I'll leave the money. Just let us walk away." Victoria stepped over the shattered porcelain and closed the distance between them. For the first time in her adult life, she didn't rely on a contract or a threat. She reached out, placing her hands firmly on his trembling shoulders. "Arthur, look at me," Victoria commanded gently. When his desperate, fearful eyes met hers, she squeezed his shoulders. "You are a hero. You walked away from billions to save a helpless child from a sociopath. You endured hell, and you still managed to build a safe world for her." Arthur swallowed hard, a single tear escaping and tracking through the sawdust still dusting his cheek. "I live every single day terrified that it isn't enough." "It is enough," Victoria promised, her voice hardening with newfound resolve. "Richard will never touch her. He will never touch you again. The parameters of our arrangement have changed, Arthur. I don't just want his company anymore. I want his absolute ruin. And I am going to make sure you and Chloe are the ones who get to watch his empire burn." Over the next 2 months, the cold, silent dynamic of the penthouse completely transformed. Victoria, who had spent her life emotionally isolated, began to actively integrate herself into their daily routine. She cancelled early morning international calls to sit at the breakfast table while Arthur made pancakes. She stopped working through the weekends and instead sat on the living room rug, patiently sliding wooden blocks toward a silently observant Chloe. The true turning point occurred in early February. Chloe suffered a terrifying arrhythmic episode. Arthur, panicked and frantic, carried her limp body into the living room, screaming for help. Victoria didn't hesitate. She bypassed a 911 entirely, utilizing her private security detail to clear a path straight to Mount Sinai's Kravis Children's Hospital. Under the blinding fluorescent lights of the pediatric intensive care unit, Victoria did not leave Arthur's side. When Dr. Harrison Caldwell, one of the nation's leading pediatric cardiologists, emerged with grim news about Chloe needing an immediate, highly experimental valve replacement, Arthur's knees buckled. Victoria caught him. She held him up, wrapping her arms around a man who had carried the weight of the world alone for too long. "Do the surgery, Dr. Caldwell," Victoria ordered, her tone brooking no argument. "Bring in every specialist you need from Boston or Johns Hopkins. I will personally underwrite the entire hospital wing if I have to. Just save our daughter." Arthur's head snapped up at the word "our." He looked at Victoria, his heart pounding in his chest. In that sterile hospital corridor, stripped of her armor and her corporate titles, Victoria Sterling was crying. The Ice Queen was gone, replaced by a fiercely protective woman who had inadvertently fallen deeply, irrevocably in love with a broken carpenter and his silent little girl. Chloe survived the surgery. During the grueling weeks of recovery, Victoria moved her makeshift office into the hospital room. She typed on her laptop with one hand, while her other hand held Chloe's tiny, frail fingers. Arthur watched this transformation from the corner of the room, a profound warmth blossoming in his chest. He realized that Victoria hadn't just provided them with a fortress, she had become their sanctuary. However, a fortress is only as strong as its gates, and Richard Hayes was a man accustomed to breaking down doors. The 6-month deadline stipulated by the Hayes Family Trust was rapidly approaching. Victoria's trap was meticulously set, but the tension in the penthouse was suffocating. Victoria had spent millions retaining attorney Jonathan Weaver from Kirkland and Ellis, the most ruthless family law litigator in the country, to secretly fast-track a bulletproof legal strategy. They just needed to run out the clock. But the devil, as always, is impatient. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening. Victoria was sitting on the velvet sofa, reading a storybook to Chloe, whose health had vastly improved. Arthur was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, humming a soft tune. It was a picture of domestic tranquility, until the private elevator doors chimed and opened directly into the penthouse living room. Victoria's head snapped up. Her private security had been bypassed. Stepping out of the elevator was Richard Hayes. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal pinstripe suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, but his eyes were entirely devoid of sanity. He held a thick legal envelope in his hand, a smug, predatory sneer twisting his features. 2 massive private security contractors flanked him. "Well, well," Richard's voice echoed off the high ceilings, dripping with venom. "Isn't this a touching scene of domestic bliss? My pathetic little brother, the corporate Black Widow, and the stolen merchandise." Arthur dropped the kitchen knife he was holding. It clattered loudly against the granite. He sprinted into the living room, immediately placing his body between Richard and the sofa where Victoria and Chloe sat. "Get out, Richard," Arthur snarled, his fists clenched, his posture radiating a lethal, protective rage. "Or what, Arthur? You'll hit me?" Richard laughed mockingly, stepping closer. "We both know you don't have the spine for it. I taught you exactly what happens when you raise a hand to your betters." Richard's eyes shifted to Victoria, his sneer deepening. "And you, Victoria, did you really think you could play this game with me? I own the judges. I own the board. I found out about your little sham marriage 3 days ago, and more importantly, I found out you are harboring a kidnapped child," Chloe whimpered, burying her face into Victoria's chest. Victoria held the child tight, gently stroking her hair, completely unbothered by Richard's theatrics. She did not stand up. She simply offered Richard a cold, empty smile. "Kidnapping is a federal offense, Arthur," Richard continued, waving the envelope. "But I am a generous man. I have the police waiting down in the lobby. Sign over your rights to the trust, annul this ridiculous marriage to Victoria, and surrender the brat to the state ward where she belongs. Do that, and I won't press charges. Defy me, and I will see you rot in a federal penitentiary." The room fell dead silent. Arthur was trembling, the old trauma threatening to pull him under. He looked back at Victoria, sheer agony in his eyes, ready to sacrifice himself again to keep Chloe safe. "Are you quite finished, Richard?" Victoria finally spoke. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It sliced through the tension like a scalpel. She gently set Chloe down on the sofa and stood up, smoothing the front of her slacks. She walked slowly toward Richard, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. "You see, Richard, your arrogance has always been your greatest liability," Victoria said, stopping just inches from his face. "You assumed I was playing checkers. I was playing a game you don't even have the intellectual capacity to understand." Victoria snapped her fingers. From the shadowed hallway leading to the guest suites, Attorney Jonathan Weaver stepped forward, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. "Mr. Hayes," Weaver said, his voice entirely professional. "I'm Jonathan Weaver, legal counsel for Mrs. Victoria Sterling Hayes. Allow me to update you on a few recent legal developments." Richard's smug expression faltered. "First," Weaver began, pulling out a stack of stamped, certified documents. "My client successfully petitioned the state Supreme Court last week. Given your documented history of violent abuse against your brother and sworn affidavits from the former staff at the Hayes estate, Arthur has been granted retroactive, full legal guardianship of Chloe under the Extraordinary Circumstances Clause." "That's impossible. The records were sealed," Richard roared, his face flushing violently red. "Nothing is sealed when you have $20 billion in leverage, Richard," Victoria countered sharply. "But Jonathan, please, get to the best part." "Yes, ma'am," Weaver continued smoothly. "Furthermore, a paternity test was legally compelled and executed using medical records retrieved during Chloe's recent heart surgery. You are confirmed as the biological father. However, because you knowingly conspired to abandon a medically fragile dependent to evade financial and social responsibility, the district attorney has officially filed charges against you for criminal child endangerment and severe financial fraud regarding the Hayes family trust." Richard took a stumbling step back, his arrogant facade completely shattering. The 2 security guards flanking him slowly stepped away, realizing their employer was now a massive legal liability. "If you walk out of this penthouse, the federal marshals waiting in the lobby will arrest you," Victoria said, her voice dripping with ice. "Your board of directors received the complete dossier of your crimes 10 minutes ago. You are out, Richard. You lose the company. You lose the trust. You lose your freedom. Now get out of my home before I have you thrown off the balcony." Defeated, humiliated, and suddenly facing the absolute destruction of his entire life, Richard Hayes turned and fled toward the elevator, a broken man walking into his own prison. When the elevator doors finally closed, the crushing weight of the last 10 years evaporated from the room. Arthur fell to his knees, his hands covering his face, a raw, ragged sob tearing from his throat. The nightmare was over. He was finally, truly free. Victoria walked over and knelt in front of him. She gently pulled his hands away from his face, framing his jaw with her soft palms. "It's over," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He can never hurt you again." Arthur looked at her, entirely overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had done. "Why did you do this, Victoria? You had his shares. You had the revenge for your father. You didn't have to risk your empire for us." "Because my empire means absolutely nothing without you in it," Victoria confessed, the truth finally breaking through her meticulously guarded heart. "I brought you here as a pawn, Arthur. But you and Chloe, you saved me. You gave me a home. You taught me that there is more to life than vengeance." Arthur reached up, his calloused fingers gently wiping a tear from Victoria's cheek. "The contract, the 18 months, he stammered, afraid to hope. Victoria smiled, a brilliant, genuine smile that illuminated the room. "I told Jonathan to shred the contract yesterday. I don't want an arrangement, Arthur. I want a husband. I want my family." Arthur leaned in, crashing his lips against hers. It was a kiss built on a foundation of profound survival, deep gratitude, and a love that had defied every possible odd. They clung to each other, two broken pieces fitting perfectly together. Suddenly, a small, tentative voice broke the silence. "Mama?" Victoria and Arthur broke apart, both freezing in shock. They turned to look at the sofa. Chloe was standing there, clutching her favorite stuffed animal, looking directly at Victoria. For the first time in 2 agonizing years, the little girl had spoken. Victoria let out a breathless sob, opening her arms wide. Chloe ran across the room and threw herself into Victoria's embrace, burying her face in the crook of her neck. Arthur wrapped his arms around both of them, burying his face in Victoria's hair. The vengeance that Victoria had sought for a decade was complete, but the victory she found in the arms of the single dad and his daughter was worth more than all the billions in the world. They were no longer pawns in a corporate war. They were a family, forged in the fire, and finally, unequivocally, home. Revenge initially brought Victoria and Arthur together, yet unconditional love cemented their unbreakable bond. Sometimes, ruthlessly calculated corporate plans shatter, making way for beautiful, unexpected miracles. What did you think of Victoria's fierce protection over little Chloe? Drop your reactions in the comments below. If this incredible story captured your heart, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling videos.